The 90s were the golden age of arcade brawlers, but they weren't all colorful heroes and lighthearted action. Some games went straight for the violence, serving up buckets of blood, bone-crunching combos, and some of the most punishing difficulty ever seen in the genre. These weren't games you casually played on a Saturday afternoon. They were the kind of titles that demanded your quarters, your patience, and sometimes even your sanity. Packed with gore, over-the-top villains, and levels designed to chew you up, they pushed the limits of what beat-em-ups could get away with. From cult classics that everyone still discusses to obscure titles that have vanished into obscurity, these games have left a lasting mark. So, let's jump into 10 of the most ultra-violent, hardest 90s arcade beat-em-ups that dared players to test their might. Night Slashers 1993. If you ever wanted a horror movie smashed into a beat-em-up, Night Slashers is about as close as it gets. Developed by Data East in 1993, this arcade gem ditched street thugs and mobsters in favor of mythical monsters. You're ripping through waves of zombies, werewolves, vampires, and bosses that look like they crawled out of a nightmare. Limbs were torn off, heads rolled across the screen, and blood sprayed in fountains every time you smashed an undead into the pavement. Players could choose between 3 monster hunters: Jake, a cybernetically enhanced brawler; Christopher, a flashy martial artist; and Hong Hua, a swift and deadly fighter. Each brought their own brutal moveset. The atmosphere was a huge part of what set this game apart. From haunted graveyards to burning towns and gothic castles, every level leaned into B-movie horror aesthetics. While other beat-em-ups sometimes censored their violence, Night Slashers went the opposite direction, pushing blood, guts, and dismemberment so far that it shocked casual arcade players in the 90s. The game rarely gave you breathing room, throwing massive enemy waves and crappy bosses at you back-to-back. It wasn't just violent for shock value, but it was tough, fast, and unrelenting. Alien vs. Predator 1994. Capcom's Alien vs. Predator arcade game was a blood-soaked crossover that gave fans exactly what they wanted. Released in 1994, the game threw players into a chaotic fight against swarms of xenomorphs, facehuggers, and hulking alien bosses. The playable roster was stacked. 2 heavily armed predators with brutal weaponry, plus 2 human soldiers who brought heavy firepower and close-quarters carnage. Unlike many beat-em-ups of the era, AVP leaned into fast-paced combat with guns, blades, and over-the-top combos that drenched the screen in gore. Blasting apart xenomorphs left their acidic blood spraying everywhere, and bosses were designed to look like living nightmares full of massive hybrids that felt straight out of the films. The violence was unrelenting, but the gameplay backed it up. Each character felt unique, and the mix of melee and ranged attacks kept the action intense from start to finish. Visually, it pushed the arcade hardware to its limit, delivering gory detail that few other titles dared to match at the time. Alien vs. Predator is remembered as one of the best arcade brawlers Capcom ever made. It combined the horror of the Alien films with the ruthless brutality of the Predator franchise, and dropped it into one of the hardest-hitting beat-em-up systems ever designed. Vendetta or Crime Fighters 2, 1991. Vendetta, also known as Crime Fighters 2, is one of those beat-em-ups that pushed the envelope so far, you almost wonder how it got away with it. Released in 1991 by Konami, It looked like another gritty street brawler on the surface. But a few minutes in, you'd realize it was far darker and much nastier than most of its competition. The premise was simple. Rescue your kidnapped comrade by smashing through gangs of thugs, bikers, and freakish criminals. Something about this game felt like it was designed to release frustration. Enemies were beaten senseless with chains, pipes, bats, and knives, often leaving them twitching on the ground. Dogs were unleashed on you. Gang members spat blood as you pummeled them, and some opponents had gruesome designs that bordered on horror. One of the most infamous elements was the sheer raunchiness of the enemy gangs. Some enemy designs and animations pushed the boundaries of censorship, with Konami incorporating a shocking amount of sleaze alongside the gore. Gameplay-wise, Vendetta was solid, featuring 4 unique characters and a fluid combo system that kept the action engaging. While its predecessor, Crime Fighters, felt tame by comparison, Vendetta ramped things up to an almost shocking level. It's a beat-em-up that truly tested the limits of what arcades could show in 1991. Crime Fighters, 1989. Before Vendetta shocked players, Konami tested the waters with Crime Fighters in 1989. It looked like a standard Final Fight-style brawler. You and up to 3 friends fight through endless waves of gang members across grimy streets, subways, and seedy clubs. Enemies didn't just fall after a punch, but they crumpled with exaggerated agony, coughing up blood or collapsing in heaps. The player characters weren't heroes so much as street enforcers, beating criminals into submission with a kind of brutality that set a darker tone than most arcade contemporaries. The atmosphere leaned into urban decay, with filthy backdrops and oppressive music underscoring the violence. Crime Fighters was an important step toward more violent beat-em-ups. It introduced the idea that arcade brawlers could be more than cartoonish fun. They could be gritty, mean, and even disturbing. The difficulty was also brutal, forcing players to keep feeding quarters to survive. Some enemies carried blades or guns, upping the stakes, and the relentless swarm of opponents left little room for breathing. Crime Fighters might feel primitive today, but at the time, its tone and harsh violence helped set the stage for Vendetta and other harder-edged brawlers. The Punisher, 1993. When you mix Marvel's most ruthless vigilante with Capcom's knack for arcade brawlers, you get The Punisher, 1993, a game that didn't hold back on violence. Players could step into the shoes of Frank Castle himself, or team up as Nick Fury, mowing down wave after wave of mobsters, ninjas, and criminals in a bloody revenge quest. Punches and kicks left enemies reeling, but it was the weapons that made things really nasty. You could grab knives, pipes, flamethrowers, and even guns, blasting enemies point blank in the face with shotguns or mowing them down with machine guns. Blood splattered, bodies dropped, and entire rooms could be cleared in seconds. Boss fights pushed the violence even further, with criminals exploding into gore when finished off. The game's pace was relentless, throwing constant enemy waves and encouraging players to unleash as much carnage as possible. For an arcade title tied to a Marvel character, it was shockingly raw. Fans remember The Punisher not just for its gameplay, but also for its unapologetic violence, which was rare for a licensed property at the time. Where most superhero games were censored or watered down, this one leaned fully into the Punisher's dark world. To this day, it's regarded as one of the most violent comic-based games ever made. Gaia Crusaders, 1999. Arriving at the very end of the arcade brawler era, Gaia Crusaders is one of those underappreciated gems that deserves way more recognition. Noise Factory developers fused classic beat-em-up action with supernatural mayhem and a shocking amount of over-the-top violence, creating this masterpiece in 1999. The story followed a group of warriors fighting to stop ancient elemental forces from destroying the world. The narrative felt like just an excuse to throw players into non-stop carnage. Fists shattered bones, magical attacks dismembered enemies, and brutal finishers left blood splattering across the screen. Enemies were obliterated, sometimes exploding into chunks in ways that felt more like Mortal Kombat than Final Fight. Gaia Crusaders was an extravagant fusion of traditional melee combat with flashy, almost fighting game-style super moves. Characters could unleash devastating specials that lit up the screen with destruction, making battles feel larger than life. Combined with smooth animation and chaotic level design, it stood out as one of the last great violent arcade brawlers. Coming out in 1999, long after the beat-em-up craze had faded, helped the game slip under the radar. However, those who did play it remember it as one of the most brutal and hard-hitting arcade brawlers of the 1990s. Guardians of the Hood, 1992. Atari's Guardians of the Hood was a rather strange mix of digitized Mortal Kombat-style characters with a beat-em-up formula, and the result was one of the grittiest and clunkiest brawlers of the decade. The game put players in control of street vigilantes tasked with cleaning up gang-infested neighborhoods. Digitized character models looked hyper-realistic for the time, and when fists connected, the violence felt raw and uncomfortable. Enemies bled, collapsed in heaps, and were sometimes left twitching after brutal finishers. Guardians of the Hood leaned heavily into urban grit, with gang members wielding chains, bats, and knives, and environments covered in graffiti and decay. While it didn't control nearly as smoothly as Capcom or Konami's hits, the sheer audacity of its design made it a memorable experience. It looked and felt more menacing, like a back alley fight caught on tape, than a typical comic book-inspired arcade game. Critics at the time weren't impressed with its clunky gameplay, but fans remember it as one of the most bizarre arcade brawlers ever released. The Combat Tribes, 1990. Technos, the team behind Double Dragon, cranked the violence up several notches with the Combat Tribes in 1990. The game's tone was unapologetically violent and gritty. While many beat-em-ups leaned toward comic book exaggeration, the Combat Tribes felt rawer and nastier, closer to real street violence than fantasy. That gave it a shocking edge in arcades, where it quickly developed a reputation for being a challenging game. It was a brutal statement of intent for the new decade. Players choose between 3 vigilantes and fight through waves of violent street gangs, each themed around a twisted subculture, namely punks, bikers, skinheads, and more. Physical violence was the main spectacle. You could grab enemies and bash their skulls repeatedly against the floor, knock them unconscious, or toss them into the environment for maximum impact. Though it didn't reach the heights of Final Fight or Streets of Rage in popularity, the Combat Tribes cemented itself as one of the most violent arcade brawlers of its time. For players in 1990, it was a wake-up call that this genre could get ugly, bloody, and absolutely relentless. Dungeons and Dragons, Shadow over Mystara, 1996. Shadow over Mystara is a game that surprised players with its violent fantasy setting. Built on the Dungeons & Dragons license, it delivered a sprawling brawler filled with magic, monsters, and a shocking amount of brutality. Unlike other fantasy-themed beat-em-ups, this one didn't shy away from gore. Swords cleaved enemies apart, magic incinerated foes into ash, and giant monsters could tear through players with violent animations. Boss fights in particular often ended with enemies erupting into violent death sequences. Shadow over Mystara stood out for its depth. Players could choose from multiple classes of characters, like fighter, thief, cleric, and more, each with unique abilities and combat styles. This added an RPG-like complexity on top of the raw arcade action. The violence was never the sole focus, but it was vividly depicted, giving the fantasy setting a darker, bloodier edge than most fans expected. Capcom balanced that with gorgeous sprite work and a surprisingly deep story campaign, making it one of the most ambitious beat-em-ups of the 90s. For fans of both tabletop D&D and arcade mayhem, Shadow over Mistara showed that fantasy could be just as violent and just as fun as urban brawls.
Metamorphic Force!
Metamorphic Force 1993. Metamorphic Force was a bizarre mix of superheroes, monsters, and sheer brutality. Dropped in 1993, it allowed players to transform into beastly hybrids, such as werewolves and minotaurs, and tear through enemies with feral power. The hook was a transformation. As a regular human, you could brawl like any other beat-em-up hero, but when powered up, you shifted into monstrous forms that unleashed devastating attacks. These beast forms weren't just strong, but they were shockingly violent. Enemies were shredded, smashed, and torn apart in a way that felt shockingly intense for a Konami title. The enemies were crappy, with demonic designs that looked like something out of a horror comic. Boss fights were especially gruesome, featuring massive creatures that could crush or dismember players with brutal animations. Combined with dark, apocalyptic stage design, the game carried a far heavier atmosphere than Konami's more family-friendly hits. While it didn't achieve the fame of Final Fight or Streets of Rage, Metamorphic Force stands out as one of the most violent experiments of the beat-em-up era. Its mix of fantasy transformations and raw gore gave it a unique identity in the genre. Marvelous verdict. The 90s arcade beat-em-up scene was like a proving ground. The fight was not just for your reflexes, but for your tolerance of over-the-top violence. These games weren't afraid to get bloody, brutal, or flat-out insane, and that's exactly why they stand out decades later. From horror-inspired splatterfests like Night Slashers, to comic book carnage with The Punisher, and the beastly mayhem of Metamorphic Force, each game carved its own violent legacy. Some became cult classics, while others faded into obscurity. Together, they tell the story of how the arcade floor was once a place of pure, unfiltered chaos. Which of these games did you sink the most quarters into? And which one do you think was the hardest? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more classic deep dives, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one.